A thin wisp of steam rises from a cup of coffee. It has long gone cold in Thomas's hand. He stares at a brochure for a local assisted living home. His fingers are trembling as he holds a pen over the signature line. Suddenly, the landline phone, silent for months, rings violently in the dead of night. A stranger's voice on the other end asks, "Are you the next of kin for David Miller?" There has been a multi-car accident on the expressway. A secret about his son's true life is about to be revealed. It is a secret that will change both their lives forever. Before we continue, please support us by subscribing to the channel. The morning sun in Oak Creek did not burst through the windows. It crept. It crawled across the scarred oak floorboards of Thomas Miller's kitchen. It illuminated the slow dance of dust motes suspended in the air. Thomas sat at his small circular table. He smoothed the checkered tablecloth with a hand that had spent decades gripping a hammer. His knuckles were thick. His skin was like weathered parchment. He checked his watch. This house was built back when craftsmanship meant something. Thomas had repaired every joist and shingle himself. But now the silence of the house felt heavier than the timber. He stood up and reached for his denim jacket. It was time for his daily ritual. The Willow Creek diner smelled of burnt coffee and maple syrup. It was the heart of this small Pennsylvania town. For Thomas, it was his stage. He slid into the corner booth where the regulars gathered. There was Bill, a retired postal worker, and Sarah, who had run the local library for ages. "How is that boy of yours doing?" Thomas Bill asked. He shifted his newspaper. "I saw on the news that the city is getting hit with a severe heat wave." Thomas felt a familiar spark in his chest. He straightened his shoulders. "David." "Oh, he is doing just fine." "Better than fine. He just landed a major account. The boy is a natural leader, a real executive in the Big Apple." Thomas took a slow sip of his black coffee. He let the words hang in the air like a trophy. "He is living the life we only dreamed of, Bill. High floors, glass walls. He is right in the middle of Manhattan, where the world happens." The table murmured in admiration. Thomas fed on it. It was the only thing that made the quiet of his empty house bearable. He didn't tell them that the last time they spoke, David sounded breathless. He didn't mention that the calls lasted less than 3 minutes. To the people of Oak Creek, David Miller was the success story of the county. He was the gold star on the map. When Thomas returned home, the house felt colder. He walked to the hallway bureau. Inside the top drawer, tied with a piece of twine, was a stack of postcards. He pulled the most recent one out. It featured a glossy image of the New York City skyline. The ink on the back was smudged. The message was brief. "Busy season, Dad. Hope you are well. Talk soon. David." Thomas traced the letters with his thumb. He remembered the day David graduated. Thomas had saved every penny from his carpentry business to send him to the university. "I want you to use your head, not your hands," Thomas had told him back then. "I want you to sit in the cool shade of an office, not out in the sun until your back breaks." He had pushed David toward the city. He had pushed him toward the glitter and the noise of the coast. Thomas looked at his own hands. They were stained with old wood glue and scarred by a slip of a chisel many seasons ago. He had wanted David to be different. He had wanted David to be elite. But as the afternoon shadows lengthened, the pride began to feel like a heavy coat. He walked into David's old bedroom. Everything was frozen in time. A dusty trophy from a baseball game sat on the shelf. A high school pennant hung crookedly on the wall. Thomas sat on the edge of the twin bed. The springs creaked. He began to wonder if he had built a house for his son or a pedestal. He spent the rest of the day cleaning. He wiped the baseboards. He polished the silver. He needed everything to be perfect, just in case. Sunday evening arrived. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Pennsylvania hills in deep purples and bruised oranges. Thomas moved his armchair so it faced the small table in the hallway. The black rotary phone sat there. It looked like a crouched predator. This was the time. Sunday at 7. That was their unspoken agreement. He sat down. He adjusted his glasses. He waited. 7:15. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to grow louder in the kitchen. 7:30. A floorboard creaked upstairs as the house settled. Thomas did not move. He imagined David in a fancy restaurant in Midtown. Perhaps he was closing a deal. Perhaps he was surrounded by friends in expensive suits. "That must be it," Thomas whispered to the empty room. "He is just busy. Important people are always busy. 8 o'clock. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner became a hammer blow. Tick. Tock. Every second was a reminder of the distance. Thomas reached out and touched the cold plastic of the receiver. He wanted to dial. He wanted to hear the ring on the other end. But he stopped. What if David was too busy to answer? What if Thomas heard the impatience in his son's voice again? He couldn't risk it. He couldn't risk breaking the image of the perfect son. 9 o'clock. The streetlights outside flickered on. They cast long, skeletal shadows of the oak trees across the lawn. Thomas remained in the chair. His eyes were fixed on the phone. The silence was no longer just a lack of sound. It was a presence. It sat in the room with him. It reminded him that his son was hundreds of miles away in a world of concrete and steel. And yet, it felt like a million. Thomas realized he was holding his breath. He let it out in a long, shaky sigh. Maybe next week, he whispered. He stood up slowly. His knees ached. The weight of the gold stars he had pinned to his son's chest was starting to crush his own heart. He turned off the hallway light. The phone remained dark and silent. Thomas walked to his bedroom in the dark. He did not want to see the dust motes anymore. He did not want to see the postcards. He only wanted to hear a voice. But tonight, the only thing that answered him was the wind rattling the windowpane of a house that was far too large for one man. The radiator in the corner of the room hissed like a dying animal. It was a metallic, rhythmic sound that filled the small studio apartment in Queens. David Miller sat on the edge of a sagging mattress. He kept his head in his hands. The walls were thin. He could hear the muffled roar of the elevated train passing just a few blocks away. He could hear the shouting of neighbors through the vents. There were no windows in this room, just 4 walls painted a peeling clinical white. In Oak Creek, his father believed he was looking out over the sparkling lights of a Manhattan skyscraper. In reality, David was looking at a pile of unpaid utility bills and a half-eaten carton of cold noodles. He looked at his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. Dark circles hung under his eyes. His jaw was covered in several days of stubble. He looked nothing like the executive his father bragged about at the diner. The corporate job was gone. It had been gone for months. A round of layoffs had swept through the firm like a scythe. David was young. He was replaceable. He was out on the street within an hour. Since then, his life had become a blur of digital maps and brown paper bags. He was a delivery driver now. He spent 12 hours a day dodging yellow taxis and angry pedestrians on a battered electric scooter. He moved fast. He had to. If he didn't deliver the food while it was hot, the app would dock his pay. And if his pay was docked, the rent wouldn't be paid. The math of the city was cruel. It was cold. It was unforgiving. David reached for his phone on the nightstand. He saw 3 missed calls from a number labeled Dad. He felt a physical tightness in his throat. It felt like a hand squeezing his windpipe. He wanted to call back. He missed the sound of the crickets on the porch. He missed the smell of sawdust in his father's workshop. But he couldn't do it. Every time he heard his father's voice, he heard the pride. He heard the expectation. How is the office, son? Is the view as good as you said? David couldn't tell him that his office was a wet sidewalk. He couldn't tell him that his view was the back of a garbage truck. He couldn't break the heart of the man who had worked himself to the bone to send him here. To Thomas, David was a hero. To David, he was a ghost, living in a city that didn't know his name. Silence was safer. Silence kept the lie alive. He stood up. His knees popped. He pulled on a neon yellow vest and grabbed his helmet. It was time for the dinner rush. Outside, the air was thick and humid. A summer storm was brewing over the East River. The sky turned a bruised electric purple. David climbed onto his scooter. The battery was at 60%. He hoped it would last until midnight. The notifications on his phone began to chirp. Pick up at 4th Avenue, drop off at 82nd Street, $5. Pick up at Broadway, drop off at 10th, $7. He sped into the traffic. The neon signs of the delis and laundromats blurred into long streaks of red and blue. Rain began to fall. It wasn't a gentle rain. It was a heavy, drenching downpour that turned the grime on the streets into a slippery film. David wiped his visor with a wet glove. He could barely see the lane markings. His phone mounted on the handlebars flashed again. A new notification appeared. It wasn't a delivery. It was an automated alert from his bank. Overdraft warning. Account balance, -$42. The words hit him harder than the rain. Negative. He was working himself to death, and he was still falling behind. He felt a surge of hot, desperate anger. He felt the weight of his father's gold stars pressing down on his shoulders, pushing him into the asphalt. He gripped the throttle tighter. He leaned forward. He needed one more delivery, just one more to get into the black. He checked the map on his screen. The turn was coming up. He had to make the light. The light turned yellow, then red. David didn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop. As he tilted the scooter to take the corner, his front wheel hit a metal manhole cover. It was slick with oil and rain. The bike vanished from under him. Time seemed to slow down. He saw the wet pavement rushing up to meet his face. He heard the screech of tires from a car nearby. He felt a sickening snap in his lower leg. His phone flew from the mount. It skittered across the dark street like a hockey puck. David slid through the gutter. He came to a stop against the curb. The world was a roar of rain and distant sirens. Pain exploded in his leg. It was a white-hot fire that consumed his vision. He tried to reach out. He tried to crawl toward his phone. 10 feet away, the screen of the phone flickered one last time. It showed a picture of a younger David and an older Thomas standing in front of a wooden house in Pennsylvania. Then a car tire rolled over the glass. The light died. The screen went black. David laid his head on the cold, wet concrete. He closed his eyes. The neon lights of the city continued to pulse above him, indifferent to the man bleeding in the shadows. The house in Oak Creek was a tomb of memories. Thomas sat at the heavy mahogany desk in the den. The only light in the room came from a single brass lamp. It cast a warm, lonely circle over a glossy piece of paper. The brochure was titled, Autumn Leaves Assisted Living. It promised a life of comfort. It promised community. But to Thomas, it looked like a surrender. He held a silver fountain pen in his hand. The nib hovered just above the signature line. If he signed this, the house would be sold. The workshop where he had spent 40 years carving wood would be cleared out. The heights of the porch where David had learned to ride a bike would belong to a stranger. Thomas felt like a waiting ghost. He was a man inhabiting a life that had already ended. His son was a titan of industry in New York. David didn't need this old house. David had glass and steel and a future that did not include a dusty town in Pennsylvania. Thomas closed his eyes. The silence of the country night was absolute. There were no crickets tonight, only the sound of his own shallow breathing. He lowered the pen. The ink touched the paper. Then the world shattered. The telephone in the hallway let out a shrill, piercing scream. Thomas flinched. The pen skidded across the brochure, leaving a jagged black scar. He looked at his watch. 2 o'clock in the morning. No one called at 2 in the morning unless the news was written in blood. Thomas stood up. His legs felt like lead. He walked into the hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He picked up the receiver. "Hello," he whispered. His voice was cracked and thin. "Is this Thomas Miller?" a woman's voice asked. She sounded tired. She sounded like she had said these words 1,000 times before. "This is Thomas. Mr. Miller, I am calling from the trauma center at St. Jude Hospital in New York City. We have your son, David Miller, in our care." The room seemed to tilt. Thomas gripped the edge of the telephone table. "Is he alive?" "He is alive," the nurse said. "But there has been a serious accident, a vehicle collision. He is in surgery for a severe leg injury. He has no other family listed, Mr. Miller. You need to come." Thomas did not hang up the phone. He simply let it drop. It swung by its cord, hitting the wall with a hollow thud. Panic is a cold thing. It does not burn. It freezes. Thomas moved through the house like a man underwater. He grabbed a small leather bag. He threw in a change of clothes. He grabbed his coat. He didn't lock the front door. He didn't care. The night air was freezing. He drove his old truck to the bus station in the center of town. The station was a single bench under a flickering street lamp. He waited for 40 minutes. Every second felt like an hour. Every tick of his watch was a heartbeat he feared his son might lose. Finally, the silver bus pulled into the lot. The brakes hissed. Thomas climbed the stairs and sat by the window. The bus began to move. He watched the familiar fields of Oak Creek disappear into the darkness. He saw the silos and the barns. They looked like giants sleeping in the mist. It was peaceful here. It was slow. But as the miles passed, the world began to change. The trees gave way to concrete barriers. The darkness gave way to a dull orange glow on the horizon. The bus crossed the bridge into the city. The transition was violent. Suddenly there were lights everywhere, blinding neon lights. The silence of Pennsylvania was replaced by the roar of the city that never sleeps. Sirens wailed in the distance. Engines growled. Thomas looked out at the towering skyscrapers. He looked for the glass office David had described. He looked for the glamour. But from the window of a bus at 4 a.m, New York looked jagged. It looked hungry. The bus stopped at the Port Authority. Thomas stepped out into a swarm of people. The air smelled of exhaust and rain. He hailed a taxi. "St. Jude Hospital," he told the driver. "Please, fast." The taxi wove through the narrow streets of Manhattan and over the bridge toward the hospital. Thomas stared at the passing buildings. Somewhere in this labyrinth of stone, his son was broken. Somewhere in this city of millions, his son was alone. The taxi pulled up to the emergency entrance. Thomas stepped out into the glare of the hospital lights. They were fluorescent. They were cruel. The lobby was filled with the sounds of misery. A child crying, a security guard shouting into a radio, the constant rhythmic beep of monitors. He pushed through the sliding glass doors. He walked to the reception desk. "My son," he said. His voice was stronger now. It was the voice of a father. "My son is David Miller. I am here for David." The receptionist typed into her computer. She didn't look up. "Wait in the green zone," she said. "Someone will come get you." Thomas sat on a plastic chair. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was almost dawn. The sun would be rising over the hills in Oak Creek right now. The dew would be on the grass. The house would be quiet. But Thomas was here. He was in the belly of the machine. He looked down at his coat. He realized he was still clutching the pen from the den. He had brought it with him by accident. He gripped the pen tight. He would not sign any brochures today. He would not be a waiting ghost anymore. A doctor in blue scrubs walked through the double doors. He scanned the room. "Family for Miller," the doctor called out. Thomas stood up. "I am here," he said. He stepped forward out of the shadows of the waiting room and into the light. He was ready to see the truth. The hospital corridor felt endless. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and floor wax. Thomas followed the doctor. Each step felt like a heavy beat of a drum. They stopped at a curtained partition in a crowded recovery ward. "Here he is," the doctor said softly. "He is awake, but he is heavily medicated." Thomas pulled back the curtain. His breath hitched. The man in the bed did not look like the executive from the postcards. He did not look like a titan of the city. David looked small. He looked fragile. His right leg was suspended in a massive white cast. His face was a map of purple bruises and shallow cuts. A plastic oxygen tube rested under his nose. "Dad," David whispered. His voice was a ghost of itself. It was thin. It was trembling. Thomas moved to the bedside. He reached out with a hand that still smelled of Pennsylvania pine. He touched David's shoulder. "I am here, son. I am right here." David tried to turn his head. He winced in pain. Then the tears began to fall. They were not the tears of a man who had just survived a crash. They were the tears of a man whose spirit had finally snapped. "I am so sorry, Dad," David sobbed. His chest heaved under the thin hospital gown. "I ruined everything." Thomas shook his head. "You didn't ruin anything. It was an accident. The doctor said you will walk again." "No," David choked out. "Not the accident. Everything else." The confession poured out of him like a flood. The words were frantic. They were desperate. The corporate job in the high-rise, it was gone months ago. The fancy dinners, they were lies. The postcards, they were a mask. "I was delivering food," Dad David said. His voice was thick with shame. "I was riding a scooter in the rain for pennies. I have nothing left. The bank took the last of my money yesterday. I am a failure." He looked away. He couldn't meet his father's eyes. "I couldn't tell you. I knew how much you wanted me to be someone important. I knew what you told your friends at the diner. I didn't want to be the reason you stopped smiling." Thomas stood perfectly still. The words hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He saw it all now. He saw the long silences. He saw the short phone calls. He saw the distance. He thought of the diner. He thought of his own voice boasting to Bill and Sarah about a son who didn't exist. He realized he had pinned so many gold stars on David's chest that his son was suffocating under the weight of them. The pride Thomas felt had not been a bridge between them. It had been a wall, a high, thick wall made of expectations and shadows. Thomas sat down on the small metal stool by the bed. He took David's hand. It was cold. "David, look at me," Thomas commanded gently. David slowly turned his face back. He was waiting for the disappointment. He was waiting for the lecture. "Listen to me," Thomas said. His voice was steady. It was filled with a deep, quiet authority. "I spent my whole life working with wood. I spent my whole life building things that would last." He squeezed David's hand. "But I forgot the most important thing. I never wanted a CEO, David. I never wanted a big house in Manhattan or a name in a newspaper. I only ever wanted a son." The room went silent. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of the heart monitor. David's eyes widened. The tension in his jaw began to melt. "I pushed you toward the city because I thought it was what you deserved," Thomas continued. "I thought it was the only way to give you a good life. But a good life is not a title. It is being where you are loved." Thomas reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out the brochure for the Autumn Leaves Assisted Living. The paper was wrinkled. The black ink from his pen was still visible where he had almost signed his life away. "I was going to sell the house," Thomas said. "I thought I was just a ghost waiting for the end. I thought you had moved on to a better world." He looked at the brochure for a moment. Then he gripped the edges of the paper. With a slow, deliberate motion, he tore it in half. He tore it again. And again. The small white scraps fell to the hospital floor like confetti. "We are not going anywhere," Thomas said. "As soon as they let you out of this bed, we are going home, to Oak Creek. The house needs work, the porch needs painting, and the garden is a mess." David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Home, home," Thomas repeated. "There is a room waiting for you. There is a father waiting for you. No more masks, David. No more lies. Just us." For the first time in years, David's breathing slowed. The frantic light in his eyes faded. He felt the weight of the city lifting. He felt the cold shadows of the skyscrapers receding. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered. Thomas leaned forward and kissed his son's forehead. The sun was beginning to climb over the New York skyline outside the window. The glass and steel were glowing in the light. But for Thomas Miller, the city had lost its power. He wasn't looking at the towers anymore. He was looking at his son. And for the first time in a very long time, he knew exactly where they were going. The tires of the old truck crunched over the gravel driveway of the Miller home. Thomas killed the engine. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the cooling metal ticking in the afternoon heat. The air was different here. It didn't smell of exhaust or hot asphalt. It smelled of cut grass. It smelled of damp earth and distant pine. Thomas walked around to the passenger side. He opened the door and helped David maneuver his heavy cast out of the cab. "Easy now," Thomas said. "One step at a time." David gripped his crutches. He swung his body forward. He stood in the driveway and looked at the house. The white paint was peeling near the eaves. The porch swing moved slightly in the breeze. It looked smaller than he remembered, but it also looked like a sanctuary. "I am actually here," David whispered. He took a deep breath. His lungs felt clear for the first time in years. There was no subway roar, no shouting sirens, just the rhythmic drumming of a woodpecker in the woods nearby. The first few weeks were slow. Recovery was a quiet business. David spent most of his time on the back porch. He watched the shadows of the oak trees stretch across the lawn. Thomas was always nearby. He didn't hover. He didn't lecture. He worked in his wood shop, the familiar scent of cedar drifting through the screen door. In the evenings, they sat together. For the first time in over a decade, the conversations were not about stock prices or fake promotions. They talked about the weather. They talked about the family recipes David had forgotten. They talked about the neighbors. One afternoon, as David's leg grew stronger, Thomas brought out a tray of small plastic pots and a bag of dark, rich soil. "If you are going to sit out here, you might as well help me with the seedlings," Thomas said. He placed a handful of dirt in David's lap. David looked at his hands. His fingers were pale. They were the hands of a man who had spent too much time clicking a mouse and gripping a scooter throttle. He pushed his fingers into the soil. It was cool. It was moist. "Just a small hole," Thomas instructed. "Drop the seed in. Not too deep. It needs to breathe." David planted a row of heirloom tomatoes. He felt a strange grounding sensation. In the city, everything he built was invisible. It was data. It was a delivery that vanished the moment it was dropped off. But this was tangible. This was a promise. As the weeks turned into months, David began to walk without the crutches. He moved with a limp, but he moved with purpose. He began to explore the local town again. He noticed things he had been too young to see before. The grocery store in Oak Creek was small. The produce was tired. The lettuce was wilted. The tomatoes were hard and tasteless, shipped in from thousands of miles away. He thought about the restaurants he used to deliver to in Manhattan. They would pay a fortune for greens that had been picked that morning. They craved anything that tasted like the earth. A spark ignited in David's mind. He looked at the 3 acres of land behind their house. Most of it was just overgrown grass and wildflowers. Dad, David said, that evening. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad. "Why don't we use the back field?" Thomas looked up from his newspaper. "For what?" "For real food." David's old city skills began to wake up. But this time, they weren't fueled by desperation. They were fueled by a vision. He knew how to build a brand. He knew how to reach people. He spent his nights researching soil pH and irrigation. He spent his days in the dirt with his father. They cleared the brush together. Thomas used his carpentry skills to build raised beds in a small greenhouse. David used his laptop to create a local subscription service. He called it Miller & Son Fresh from the Ridge. He didn't aim for a global empire. He aimed for the 20 families in the next town over. He offered farm-to-table boxes, fresh eggs, heirloom tomatoes, snap peas that crunch like ice. The first time David posted the service on the local community board, his heart raced. It was the same anxiety he felt when waiting for a delivery rating in the city. But an hour later, the first order came in, then another. By the end of the week, they were sold out. David stood in the middle of the field. His boots were covered in mud. His skin was tanned by the Pennsylvania sun. He looked at the rows of green shoots pushing through the earth. He wasn't an executive. He wasn't a success by the standards of a Manhattan boardroom. He was a farmer. He was a son. Thomas walked out to join him. He handed David a glass of cold water. "The boy from the city has dirt under his fingernails," Thomas joked. David laughed. It was a loud, honest sound. "It feels better than a suit, Dad." Thomas looked out over the field. He looked at the greenhouse. He looked at the vibrant life returning to a land that had been silent for too long. He realized that the American dream wasn't always about moving up. Sometimes it was about moving back. It was about finding the strength to plant something and wait for it to grow. The sun began to set behind the ridge. The valley was bathed in a soft golden light. David looked at his father. He saw the pride in Thomas's eyes. But this time, it wasn't a weight. It was a blessing. It was the fuel that would keep him moving one row at a time. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like a soft white blanket. David Miller stepped onto the porch. He held a steaming mug of coffee. He didn't check a stock ticker. He didn't look at a delivery app. Instead, he looked at the horizon. The 3 acres behind the house were no longer overgrown. They were a tapestry of vibrant greens and deep reds. Rows of kale and Swiss chard stood tall. The greenhouse hummed with life. The small backyard project had transformed. It was now a flourishing boutique farm. The local community had embraced them. David was no longer the invisible man in the neon vest. He was the man who provided the town with its best harvest. He was the heart of the Saturday market. People didn't just come for the vegetables. They came for the story. They came to see the man who had traded the concrete jungle for the Pennsylvania soil. The farm had become a bridge. On the weekends, cars from the city began to appear on their gravel road. Folks from the high-rises drove for hours to breathe the fresh air. They wanted to touch the dirt. They wanted to buy greens that were still cool from the morning dew. David found himself talking to them. He shared his journey. He spoke of the peace he had found. He wasn't chasing a promotion anymore. He was chasing the perfect harvest. And in that pursuit, he had found his soul. Thomas sat in his rocking chair, watching his son work. The old man's workshop was busier than ever. He was building custom crates for the farm deliveries. He was carving signs for the farm stand. He was no longer a waiting ghost. He was a partner. He was a companion. As the afternoon light began to soften, David finished the last of the irrigation checks. He walked up the porch steps and sat beside his father. His boots were stained. His hands were calloused. He looked at Thomas and smiled. It was a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that didn't hide a single secret. The sun began to dip behind the rolling hills. It painted the rows of crops in shades of gold and amber. Thomas looked at the land. Then he looked at his son. He realized a profound truth. David did not need to conquer the world to be great. He did not need a corner office to be worthy. He didn't need to be a giant in a city of millions to make his father proud. Thomas reached over and patted David's hand. The gold stars of the past were gone. In their place was something much brighter, a father's simple, quiet love. David had found his way back to the earth. He had found his way back to his father, but most importantly, David had finally found his way back to himself. The house was no longer too large for one man. It was exactly the right size for a family. The shadows grew long. The crickets began their evening song, and in the heart of Oak Creek, two men sat in peace watching the harvest of their hearts grow toward the sky. Success is not measured by the height of a skyscraper or the size of a bank account. It is found in the quiet moments of connection and the courage to be our true selves for those we love. If this story moved your heart today, please tell us where you are watching from in the comments, whether it is your peaceful hometown or a busy city. To walk with us through more of these journeys, subscribe to the channel and stay for a while. Now, a new story is appearing on your screen, ready to be told. Click on it to keep the warmth in your heart a little longer.